So, did you know that we make about 35,000 decisions every day? 35,000. That is an insane amount of decisions when you think about it. But here's the thing, that's life. Life is filled with decisions. Now, I'm not too sure how many critical decisions we make on a day to day basis. Not sure what that number is, but I will say this, at some point in your life, and I do believe the older you get, there will be more critical decisions that have to be made. You will have to start weighing the kind of approaches or the kinds of approaches that you are leveraging when it comes to very difficult decisions. Why am I saying that? Because not every decision is weighed in the same way. So let's take a look at two different frameworks. Y'all know I love frameworks. Let's take a look at two different frameworks and then talk about at the end of the day what you're still going to have to do anyway, regardless of the framework that you choose. So the first one is the pros and cons list. And you've probably have done this before. With this pros and cons method, the first thing that you do is you identify the decision to be made. That's key. You got to be super clear on this. You got to clearly define the nature of the decision that you need to make. Because if that's not clear, everything else is going to fall through the cracks. The framework is hinged upon you being super clear on what that decision is. The next thing that you're going to do is you're going to list the options. So you're going to write down all of the possible options or courses of actions that can be made based on that decision that would be executed against. And then what you're going to do is you're going to draw a pros and cons table. So for each option, you list the pros, which would be the benefits, and then that's going to be on one side of the table, and then the cons or the drawbacks on the other side of the table. Remember, this is probably something that you've already have done in the past, but I'm listing it out this way for a very particular reason. Because after you do that, what you're going to do is you're going to evaluate the pros and evaluate the cons. You're going to assign weights or importance to each pro and con. So what you're going to do is you don't necessarily have to put a number to it. Not quite, but there's some sort of method. Maybe it's an asterisk that you put like, okay, this particular pro is very important. This particular con is very important. And the reason why you want to do that is because it's going to reflect the significance. So there really aren't any numbers per se attached to this outside of the exhaustive list of if the pros outweigh the cons. What you then will do is you're going to analyze and compare. So you're going to look at the balance of the pros and the cons for each option. You're going to consider which options have the most significant pros and the least significant cons. This is key. I'll say it again. It's not just about the amount of pros and cons. It's the amount of most significant cons. Oh, wow. The most significant pros and the least significant cons. So you might have a particular option based on a decision that you've made or a consequence, and it has a lot of pros, but those pros are inconsequential to, let's say, 3 cons. So you've got 10 pros on one side, 3 cons on the other, but every single con that is listed in this particular option that you can choose outweighs all 10 of those pros. Are you going to choose that particular option? Absolutely not. That's self-sabotage, actually. After you analyze and compare, you're going to make a decision. I know that sounds obvious. You have to choose. You have to, in a sense, pull the trigger. And when you do that, you choose the option, once again, with the most favorable balance of pros over cons, taking into account the weight of each. You review your decision, and after some time, you evaluate the outcome of the decision to learn from the process. This is key. Why is that important? Because oftentimes we'll make particular decisions over and over again, and if we don't review those specific decisions, what ends up happening is the same results. You've heard this saying before, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Well, the reason why that's happening is because you likely have not reviewed what is happening after you make a particular decision. And if you have reviewed it and you know what's going to happen, then you simply are self-sabotaging. So you're intentionally making a decision knowing what's going to happen every single time. Okay, so what this method is most effective for is creating a thorough, I would say, pretty thorough exploration of the options, and it provides a visual representation of the factors that are involved, helping to clarify the decision making process. I would put that methodology on the quantitative side. Pros have to outweigh the cons, but significant pros have to outweigh the significant cons. But then there's another decision making method that's called the decision matrix analysis. That's also called the PUGH matrix method. And this also has a set of steps. So the first thing that you need to do is first clearly define what your decision is. And that's like the prerequisite. After you do that, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to list your options once again. Write down all of the possible options or solutions that you're considering. You'll then determine, this is where it gets different, you're going to determine the criteria. By determining the criteria, you identify each of the criteria important for making the particular decision. These should cover all aspects that are significant to that specific decision. Do not deviate. And they can be qualitative or quantitative. Now, remember I put the pros and cons method on the quantitative side, but this is talking about criteria that require particular options. So, I shouldn't use the word options, but it's going to require particular factors. So, for instance, maybe it's cost. Maybe a criteria is efficiency. Maybe a criteria is ease of implementation. So you see how cost is more quantitative? Durability might be more quantitative, but ease of something, in this case implementation, is a little bit more qualitative. Efficiency, depending on how you're using it, can be quantitative or qualitative. All right, so those are the examples when we're talking about listing the options, but then determining the criteria, and that criteria either being qualitative or quantitative. And actually, you should have, I would say, strive for a mixture of both. Strive for criteria that you can assign numbers to, but not every kind of criteria or decision is going to have quantitative factors to it, especially if it's relational. Many times, it's a lot of it's going to be qualitative versus a business decision, which is and should be heavily quantitative. And so it really depends on what you're deciding to do. Then what you're going to do after you've listed the options, determine the criteria, you create a decision matrix. So you set up a grid or table where one axis, usually on the vertical, is listing the criteria. So remember, like ease of implementation or cost, durability, that's going to be on the vertical axis. And this is like in a chart. And then horizontally, what you'll do is you will list the actual options. All right. And then what you're going to do is, based on those options, just put in like, okay, this is the decision. And if I do this, this is perhaps the outcome or the behavior that I need to do. And based on that, here is what the cost will be. Here is what the durability would be, or whatever the case is. And this is optional, but after you list options, determine the criteria, create a decision matrix where you have the options as well. You then assign weights to the criteria. Now, you don't have to do this. This is actually, like I said, this is optional. However, it can be very helpful in making complex decisions, because if some criteria are more important than others, you assign that weight to reflect its importance, very similar to the pros and cons list. And quite frankly, many of you might not have ever put a weight on your pros and cons. You might have just looked at, okay, there are more pros and more cons, but you realize now that we've looked at it, it's not just about the sheer number of pros over cons. It's the sheer number of quality, significant pros over significant cons. Same thing now with the decision matrix. You have to assign a weight to these options. Well, you don't have to, but you should, Because then what you're going to do is you're going to rate each option. So you're going to score each option against each criterion. So the score can be something on a simple scale of like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Usually 1 to 5 is like the Likert scale. You depending on what it is, you probably wouldn't do something like strongly agree versus disagree. That's not what that is. It's really like 1 being insignificant and 5 being very significant. I tend to side with the less amount of numbers that you use, the easier it's going to be to weigh them. If you start, going to 10 or 15, it just gets very muddled in the middle. Muddled in the middle. You start using 6s and 7s versus really getting specific. Like, is it a 3? Is it just really it's significant but not really, or is it 5? Is it really significant? Similar to like rating movies. There's something about when I look at the Roger Ebert website, and even when he was alive, I would rate or compare my movie rating to his, and it was almost always the same, which is wild. Of course, he articulated why his rating was the way it was better than I could. But a rating of 4, where you give somebody a 2.5 out of 4 stars, feels more significant than giving someone a 3 out of 5. I don't know, just the 4 rating was very significant. Okay, so let's back up, because now you rate each option, right? And you score each option against a criterion, where the higher scores represent a better match to the criterion. So the way that you do that is by calculating the weighted scores. Or this is what you do next. You calculate the weighted score. So if you've assigned the weights, what you do is you multiply the score for each option by the weight of the criterion to get weighted scores. If not, you'll just use the raw score. So for instance, if you had a particular criteria of cost, and the cost for option A, let's say on a scale of 1 to 5 is a 3, then that's what you would do. It would be a 3. But if you weighed that that particular criteria, let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, cost is high. Cost is a 5. Then you would take that 5 and multiply it by that option that you have weighted as a 3, and now you get 15. Why is that important? Because let's say you have cost, or option A is a 3, and you have efficiency in option A, which is also a 3, but cost, the criteria is 5, but efficiency, the criteria is 1. So now when we look at option A, based on what's going to happen if you choose, remember, option A can be a behavior, option A can be a result or a consequence, whatever option A is based on the cost. Now it's 3, the actual option, times 5, the weight of the criteria of the cost, which gives us 15, versus 3, which is the option A, times 5 for efficiency, which gives us, times 1, which gives us a 3. So it stays at 3. So you have a 15 weighted for option A in the cost versus 3, which is weighted as well, but not as significant as cost, which gives us that difference between 15 and 3. I hope that makes sense. And the reason why is because what you end up doing is in option A, you tally all of the criteria. So you tally cost, efficiency, durability. You add them up. And when you add them up, you get a total, all for option A. You do the same thing for option B. You do the same thing for option C. Remember, this is if you're making more complex decisions. And it sounds a little bit more complicated, and maybe I should just like create or put some sort of chart up so that you can actually see this. But the point is, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to add up those scores, and then you analyze the results. The option with the highest total score is generally the most preferable one. Generally, because there's always going to be some wiggle room as to some intangibles or some variables that you might not have considered, or that you have weighed in, that aren't necessarily in the chart per se. And after you analyze the results, and you have to look closely at how the options score on individual criteria, especially if some are critical, you then review and then you decide. You consider the matrix results and any other qualitative factors that are not captured in the matrix to make a well-informed decision. So, this method is particularly effective for complex decisions where multiple criteria are involved and where an objective, structured comparison of options is needed. And it also helps in just making decisions that are justifiable and transparent. So, why is that important? It's important because at some point, you're going to make some difficult decisions. And depending on the kind of decisions that you make, you might need something that's a little bit more qualitative, where you're looking at the complexity of many different factors, or you're going to be doing something a little bit more quantitative, where it's also a difficult decision, but it's probably not as complex. So there are different approaches to different decisions that have to be made, to different problems that you'll have, and how you're going to, what tools you're going to use. But at the end of the day, y'all, at the end of the day, you probably already know what I'm going to say next. Both methods end in making a decision. And guess what? That's not something that you can tally on a paper, if that makes sense. Meaning, it has to come from you. Like, you have to leave the chart on the paper or the computer, whatever you've put it on, and you actually have to do the work. You have to put the action, the decision into motion. I believe decision comes even from the point of cutting away, the etymology of it, of making decisions and removing things away. That's what a decision is. What you're doing is you're removing all of the other options off of the table in order to make one singular move. So many times when it's complex, it's more complex because there's so many different things that are connected to each other, whether it's feelings, emotions, money, I don't know. I'm trying to think. That's usually the biggest one, right? Time, money, and people, right? It's all connected. But there's usually this web of interwoven connectedness of people or circumstances or whatever the case is, and it just feels difficult to untangle it. Well, don't untangle it. What you need to untangle is the decisions that need to be made, and you focus on one at a time. And here's the crazy thing: even if you make the wrong decision, don't even think about the fact or think about it in that light. Oh, I made the wrong decision. No, you made the best decision based on the information that you had available. I think even by thinking about the way that we talk and how we create, like, binary ways of, well, this is a right decision, this is a wrong decision. When it comes to complexity, it's not really about right or wrong. It's maybe about good, better, best. I learned this from the book Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Bested. Good, better, best, or bested, right? What's the better? And bested meaning like, somebody has bested you. So the point is, there's probably a better decision that can be made, but maybe you don't have all of the information. And so you've made the right or the most, I'm using the word right, but you're making the most appropriate decision with the facts, with the figures, with the feelings, with all of that you have, the options, the weightedness of the categories that you've created, of the criteria that you've developed or that you've assessed. You've made the best decision. Live with that, sit in it, review it, and then guess what? Make another decision. Most times it's not even about making the best decision, it's just making a choice, moving in that choice, and then when the time comes, of course, with some reflection, making another choice. Okay, that's it. So we looked at the frameworks for decisions today. So what that means is we'll likely be breaking down for the rest of the week decision frameworks and just looking at understanding this particular, or maybe these two particular frameworks, pros and cons, the decision matrix, maybe even I might even throw in the SWOT analysis is another one. That's a very common one. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And hopefully this week you will be equipped with some tools in order to make more appropriate decisions when it comes to complex challenges. And that's the key.